Hello, everybody. Welcome to AZ Security, the new channel in which we present the latest security updates about the Microsoft Azure technology. My name is Dylan Paardenkoper. I'm working as a cloud architect at IT Impressive. And today I have a special guest, and this is Koos Goossens.
Hi, Dinant.
Hi, Koos.
Thanks for having me.
It's great and my pleasure to have you here. And today we're going to talk about building your security data lake with Sentinel and Azure Data Explorer. But
That's
first
right.
of all, can you introduce yourself, Koos?
Yes, of course. So my name is Koos Goossens. That's a really Dutch name to pronounce in English. English-speaking people would pronounce it differently, I guess. Um, I work at a company called Wortel, which is a Microsoft security service provider. Up until this year, I was a cloud and security consultant. So I have a background in cloud infrastructure and was focusing more and more on the Microsoft security stack the last couple of years. So I did big projects at customers, particularly surrounding Microsoft Sentinel. That's why we're talking about Sentinel tonight.
True.
And as of this year, I am responsible for everything that is tech related in the backend of our managed detection and response service. So we provide a service for customers who don't have their own security department and they don't have the hours and expertise to look at all the alerts that are coming from the Microsoft security products. So we help them. One of my things I'm responsible for is making sure that everything's deployed with code, automated at scale, so that we deploy all the analytic rules and all the Sentinel and everything to our customers. So that's where my expertise with Sentinel and cloud infrastructure comes in.
Wow, that's a mouthful. And congratulations with your new function.
Yeah, thanks. So it's a bit different for me because I was working for directly for customers as long as I can remember, as long as I'm working in IT. So I hope I don't get bored with the one place working from one office for years in a row. But we'll see. At least there's a lot of technical challenges ahead. So that's a good idea.
Well, it sounds challenging to me, to be honest. But you also have customer contacts, right? Or is it really to one place?
Yeah, well, sometimes I'm not responsible for the actual incident response. We have a big team who are responsible for that 24/7 around the clock, 7 days a week. But sometimes there are some issues, technical issues, but also maybe customers are having some issues with costs. And since this is also one of my pet peeves, they tend to call me and I'll do some investigation for them and see where the pain points are and help them solve them. So I do have some customer contact still, yes, but it's not the majority any longer.
Well, it sounds that you have a few teasers coming up here. Just a short question for the audience as well. How long are you already an MVP?
Um, this is my second renewal coming up, so this will be my third year when I'm renewed. Yeah, so 2023 I became MVP. Yeah, so
We
it's 2 years. Yeah.
we can shake hands because it's for me it's the same.
Same year. Okay. Well, that's nice. Yeah. So I'm also going to the MVP Summit in March, and that will be my third time to Summit because I became MVP right before the first time. So I was lucky and I could
Yeah.
just go over there. Will you be joining MVP Summit?
I wish I had the time, but I have to say
Ah,
no this time. But
that's
for the
too bad.
next, I definitely want to be there.
Yeah.
It's a great opportunity to meet everybody.
Yeah.
Also, a lot of product teams to
Yeah.
discuss with all MVPs over the world. And
Yeah.
one of the initiatives we are having here is just try to join with others. So, but yeah, I have to sadly say that I'm not being present there.
No, it's understandable. It's also a challenge with time and also cost, of course. It's expensive to go over there. But it's great to see your entire Twitter and LinkedIn feed in real life, right?
Yeah,
Everybody who you know by name and hopefully by face, you can finally meet them there in person. That's great.
yeah, and don't forget the Wall of Fame, right? All
Yeah,
the names.
yeah, of
I've
course.
seen mine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, for me, it wasn't never a goal per se. I was actually surprised when someone nominated me the first time,
Oh, really?
but it's great to be part of it. Yes, and like you said, you have an entry point into the product teams as well to discuss roadmaps and future features, which is great.
That's very pleasant, and it's most helpful because you have a face and they have yours.
Yeah,
You can ask and improve specific topics,
yeah,
and you're seeing that they are really listening, and that's very pleasant to
yeah,
work with.
yeah. I agree.
Definitely. So today, building your data lake
Yes.
with security.
Yes, well, I have prepared a couple of slides, so perhaps it's a good idea to start
Yeah,
with those.
by all means, the
Put them on
stage is
screen.
yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Let me see if I can share this part. I hope this is coming up.
Yes, the screen is
That's
viewable.
great. Well, I particularly mention a security data lake because that is a term that is generally used for security logging and also referred to as by Microsoft in their cybersecurity reference architecture. I'm not sure if I can move away this Riverside.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah, now
that's
it's
helpful.
this is better. Um, so I actually use this screenshot from that architecture reference because if you look closely, you'll see that security data lake is referenced in there. Microsoft is actually referring to Microsoft Sentinel as a security data lake, which is their cloud native SIEM solution, of course. And they also depict that you can store all your security and network logs from third parties in there. And as you're probably already familiar, Microsoft Sentinel is built upon Azure Log Analytics. And due to the cost model, how they which are using for Sentinel, you pay a certain amount per gigabyte you ingest. I'm not sure why PowerPoint is now okay. Sorry for that.
That was
It
the
is
wrong way around.
yeah, it is shown in euros per gigabyte, but since euro and dollar are about the same amount right now, these are Western Europe prices, default list prices. But just to give you an idea, the Sentinel solution on top of Log Analytics will add an additional cost per gigabyte. And because of this, I see companies really struggling with the fact that they want to store their network logs, for example, struggling with Microsoft Sentinel because of the high cost associated with it. And I see companies moving away from Microsoft Sentinel for that reason.
Okay.
And that is something I wanted to touch on tonight, because you probably already have a feeling where this is going, but more on that in a second.
You're making us curious, definitely.
But first, I think Microsoft is already putting a lot of effort in making your life a little bit easier with Sentinel and the price department because they have now several different table plans. It all started with analytics logs. Later, they added basic logs, and now they also added quite recently auxiliary logs, which is still in preview. I was actually surprised that it is still in preview right now. I was actually expecting this becoming GA last Ignite, actually, but apparently it wasn't ready, so it's still in preview.
Indeed, it was shared, I think, a month ago with the Defender for Cloud Ninja team,
Yeah.
which was pronouncing like, well, it's here, it's almost in GA.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, they probably have some creaks to iron out probably in the back end. I wanted to share a couple of pros and cons for each of these logs to fully understand what your options are inside Microsoft Sentinel and why and how you could look elsewhere perhaps as an alternative. So analytics, again, that is the initial tier that Microsoft shipped with, I believe, 5 or 6 years ago when it became GA. It is obviously high performance storage. You have real-time detection capabilities. You can build your dashboards on it. Every table in Sentinel is supported because, yeah, logical analytics was the original tier for logging tables. So all tables are analytics by default. You can store up to 720 days of retention, and well, you pay the standard pricing as shown in the slide prior, which comes down to a total of a little over €5 or $5 per gigabyte. You can lower that amount even if you are willing to commit upfront. So larger companies who already know that they are storing, let's say, 200, 300, 400 gigabytes a day, they can pay upfront a certain amount and they get discounts. And the discounts can get as low as a little over $2.50 per gigabyte. But then you will have to commit for the highest commitment tier. It will be very expensive in the end. A little bit similar like what they do with reserved instances for virtual machines, right?
Yes.
Where you decide that you have certain virtual machines, which you already know you're going to have running for a couple of years, and then you get some discounts on that. So basic tiers was added later. I'm not sure why. There it is. Sometimes the mouse is not touching on the next slide, but whatever.
It's working.
Microsoft calls this, instead of your high value data, your medium touch data. It is still high performant, but with a very reduced cost. You can see here on the bottom, it's a little less than $1 per gigabyte. You can still build dashboards, but there's a small caveat, and that's why I put an asterisk there, because queries are not included. Every KQL query you run against the data will be charged separately, and that is why you might want to be careful with dashboards, right? Because if you refresh them all the time, you incur additional cost that way as well. Another big downside is that you do not have the capability to do real-time alerts on there. So your analytic rules in Sentinel cannot query basic log tables. And this is a big downside because then you cannot do any incident response on those logs. Microsoft does have a new feature recently. I won't be covering that in detail. They call it summary rules. You can create KQL functions upfront, and they get scheduled and run periodically against your tables, basic and auxiliary tables, for example, and the results are stored in a separate table. That way you can have somewhat of an interactive triggering of certain output on these logs.
It feels like that you have to trick
Yeah.
a bit.
Yeah, Microsoft is really coming up with all kinds of alternatives to bring the cost down. Another downside is that in the basic logs you have some limited KQL functionality. It is not as limited as when basic logs shipped initially, but still some advanced joins, for example, or some other advanced functions are not available. And you can only enable basic logs on certain supported tables, so custom tables, some log tables from, for example, for your Apache HTTP logs, but you cannot convert a table like sign-in logs to basic, for example.
Oh, so you really have to deep in the details to see if it's really fitable, right?
Yeah. And most, spoiler alert, most default tables from Microsoft are not supported to convert to basic. So it's mostly used for custom logs, I would say. Also, your retention is limited, only 30 days maximum. You can extend it, but into an archive, which Microsoft introduced a couple of years ago. But then you can extend the retention, but then you have to do a restore from archive when you need to access the logs. So that's also quite a big downside, I would say.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
And then you can store up to 12 years, similar to analytics, which is great for regulatory compliance requirements, for example, but not very feasible if you really want to look through logs from let's say, your firewall logs from a couple of weeks ago. Then it might not be really interesting.
I can imagine. Then you have to first restore it.
Yeah.
Then it takes a lot of time.
It takes time, and that restore will be charged separately again, so you have to pay for that. So I don't see it being used very often, to be honest. But again, for those regulatory compliance requirements, it might be a good idea to store it for 12 years. But I might have some alternatives later on. So auxiliary logs were added very recently, a couple of months ago. Microsoft calls this ideal for your low-touch data, absolute minimum cost, even much cheaper than basic, as you can see here. But for now, only available for custom logs. It is less performant, so it's slower to become. Your results will come back slower from your queries. Your queries are still not included, so you have to pay for them separately. Again, the same limitations in KQL, same limitations in retention. Even the total retention in archive is also limited, but and that's why I added 2 asterisks here. I do expect that this is a preview limitation. I can imagine that they will lift that limitation once it becomes GA, but I cannot promise anything.
Well, if a lot of customers are leaving basically Azure Sentinel, they
Yeah.
probably have to do something, right?
Yeah, and that's also something I'll touch on later. I think Microsoft is also seeing people moving away from Microsoft Sentinel, perhaps to Data Explorer or other solutions. And one of the problems there might also lie, but this is my own opinion and my own idea. This is not confirmed by Microsoft in any way, but I do expect that they have some difficulties with Copilot for security, for example, Security Copilot along the way, because Security Copilot is able to dig into your Sentinel data, but not data that lives in Azure Data Explorer, for example.
That's
So that might be,
interesting.
in the long run, a reason why they also would like to keep it interesting for you to stay in Sentinel.
I can imagine that, but
Yeah.
we will see.
Yeah, that's true. The time will tell. And there are some other preview limitations, like not all Azure regions are currently supported. Most of them are, to be honest. There are some limitation with certain data types. You cannot do any real-time transformation on the logs, but well, those are very more advanced things to consider. On the other hand, auxiliary logs is free for now, while it is in preview. And Microsoft has already promised that when you decide to use auxiliary logs in preview, you will never be charged for those logs in those tables when it becomes GA afterwards. So it might be interesting if you have some very chatty, high volume logs you want to ingest somewhere to look into
Kubernetes.
auxiliary logs and keep it free forever.
Kubernetes is provisioning a lot of logs.
Yeah, I know. I noticed. Yeah, I'm not very familiar in detail with Kubernetes on the technical side, but I have seen the AKS logs in Sentinel. Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's for another day, right?
Yeah, that's true.
I will talk to you through.
So those were the table tiers, but Microsoft is also putting some other additional efforts into providing a data lake-like experience with Sentinel in the form of combining Sentinel with all the other Defender products. So years ago, when Sentinel was released, all these Defender products, if I can call them that, had their own portals. Most of them had their own portal. And Sentinel acted as a sort of an orchestrator between all of those different portals by combining all the alerts together in one Sentinel, right? Now things have shifted a bit. The Defender XDR portal, Microsoft 365 Defender, how you want to call it, security.microsoft.com is actually the new place where all the Microsoft security products nowadays live. And also Microsoft Sentinel, even though it is still underwater a Azure resource, it can also now be onboarded into the Defender portal. And this has a lot of benefits because now you have a real single pane of glass still with all your incidents across all of the Microsoft security products, including Sentinel, as you can see highlighted here. And you can also go to advanced hunting and hunt for all the logs that are residing in both Defender XDR, like your Defender for Endpoint logs, for example, and also your Sentinel logs together in one place. And I think this is great because this also eliminates the need of sending those logs back to Sentinel, which is something you had to do a couple of years ago.
Yeah, I remembered.
Yeah, which was
I
also
still
very
do.
costly. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
it looks promising if there is just one dashboard to fit
yeah,
all of them into one.
Yeah. So when we're talking about security data lake, I would say this can also be considered part of your data lake because here you can search through logs in Sentinel and in Defender for Endpoint. And Defender for Endpoint, as you might know, also has a very usable logs like all the network traffic coming to and from your endpoints and all kinds of process information and file information on those machines, which is great that you can query it here.
Definitely, yeah, totally agree.
One downside is, however, that all those logs mentioned earlier are only accessible for 30 days, last 30 days, all the raw logs, I must say. So the retention in the Defender portal is longer, but the raw logs can only be queried for 30 days and back. Microsoft will probably tell you that you can extend those into Sentinel. So in Sentinel, you have a data connector and you can enable all these tables and then you streamline those logs there. And of course, you can keep them longer that way. But this will become expensive, very expensive, very quickly. I've seen customers messing around with this, and they very quickly realized that they should disable this because, again, because of those high costs, because this is stored in analytic tables, so with the highest pricing, and again, it's not very feasible because most of these customers want to store those logs long term for perhaps forensics reason or incident response or again regulatory compliance requirements. They don't need high performance data in Sentinel for that. So and this was actually the first reason why I started looking into Azure Data Explorer. And that's why I called it here Partners in Crime, because I used Azure Data Explorer to send the Defender for Endpoint logs to store them there at a lower rate. But together with Sentinel, and I would even say together with the whole XDR stack, I would consider this your ideal security data lake, combining all these different resources together. I will get back into more detail on how usable this is and how easy accessible the logs are between all these different products. But I want to dive a little bit deeper in the nuts and bolts, so to speak, of Azure Data Explorer first. Are you familiar with Data Explorer, Dinant?
Yeah. I'm very familiar with it. A little bit the same of the reason, just offloading the log files for
Okay.
longer purposes, and mostly from the security perspective, because my role is as a security architect. They do want to have the logs longer, or if
Hmm.
there is, for some reasoning, a security incident, you have to
Yeah.
deep dive longer years back.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, offloading to Data Explorer, it's a familiar face,
Yeah.
basically.
Okay. Well, that's good to hear. Well, yeah, that's very understandable. Well, for you, this won't be new, but for the viewers and listeners, it
Yeah.
might be. So, Azure Data Explorer is a fully managed service you run in Azure, capable of processing large volumes of data. It supports high-speed data ingestion. You can connect all kinds of resources to there. And it also uses Kusto query language, so KQL. And did you know, Dinant, that Kusto actually originated in Azure Data Explorer? This was the first resource to use Kusto.
No, that's new to me.
Okay, well, yeah, so Azure Data Explorer was first called Kusto, and if you deploy it from code with an ARM template or a bicep, you'll notice that it's still called a Kusto resource, and that is for this reason. So it all started here, and the name Kusto, which is also a fun fact, I guess, came from
Yeah.
the French diver named Jacques Cousteau. You know the story?
Yeah, I know
Ah,
the
okay.
story, but
Yeah.
I definitely like it that you're telling it here.
Yeah, okay. So the Microsoft was thinking about Jacques Cousteau as a diver and the similarities between diving into your ocean of data, right, and finding some treasures there, and that was what Jacques Cousteau also did. So that's why the name Cousteau came from there. So I think it's a fun story.
And one question back to you. Where did you use Azure Data Explorer mostly for? Was it also
Uh,
from the Sentinel part that you
Yeah, I
explained?
started using it when I started implementing Sentinel, and especially customers who wanted to migrate their existing SIEM solutions from Splunk or
Yeah.
ArcSight or QRadar, and they wanted to migrate to Sentinel, for example. They had a loads of log sources which they wanted to keep, right? And we had a discussion in those migration projects. Do you really want to keep them? Yes, because we're used to having those logs, right? You know the story, and it wasn't very feasible to store it in Sentinel because of the cost perspective, and that's why I started looking into alternatives, and Azure Data Explorer and blob storage and all kinds of other candidates came by, and Azure Data Explorer stuck.
Nice. Yeah. Totally familiar. Exactly what you're saying. A place to store it, mostly cheaply,
Yeah,
and still having the possibility to query it basically
yeah.
and deep dive, do analysis.
Yeah, and I have some tricks and some neat things to share later to help you get started. But it is very flexible, but you still have an additional resource to tend to, right? You have to manage an additional resource, even though it is fully automated. Um, Again, elastic compute and storage, and it can handle literally petabytes of data. And again, it's very cost efficient. We touched on that already. So when you run Azure Data Explorer, you'll see a single resource in the Azure portal. But in the back and on your bill, you'll see, if you look behind the curtain, you'll see that a couple of resources are actually behind it. Virtual machines, virtual network, storage, load balancers, and obviously also the Azure bandwidth that comes with it. These are things you'll see on your invoice at the end of the month. Even though Azure Data Explorer is looking like a singular resource in the Azure portal. And
That is not what people would expect, I guess.
no. That's why I wanna mention this.
Yeah.
And the type of virtual machines depend on the size of your Azure Data Explorer cluster. You know that when you create one, you can even scale up and scale. No, I cannot come with a proper term. You can scale up to bigger servers, but you can also scale laterally with more servers to improve your performance.
Do you mean horizontal and vertical?
Yeah, horizontal and vertical.
Okay.
But Microsoft calls it scale up and scale. I'm not sure what the other term is. Well, anyway, you know what I mean. Yeah.
I think so.
Yeah. So regarding to storage, Microsoft tells you that in ADX you have up to 100 years of data retention. I guess that's enough, right, for most companies.
I sure hope so.
You can apply data compression, and this is also one of the reasons it's also cost efficient. I have seen instances where data is actually 12 times smaller on storage than when it came into Azure Data Explorer. So this is already a big win compared to Sentinel, for example, where you do not have data compression. You can add caching on SSDs, which is optional. But I would advise to be very, very careful with that because it will be very costly, of course, right? If you ingest hundreds of gigabytes a day and you want your caching to be also available to look back at multiple days, you'll end up with a lot of SSD storage. And I think you are actually recreating another log analytics yourself with similar pricing. So I think it defeats the purpose a bit. So log ingestion can be done in a lot of different ways. You have native connections. So these are Azure resources which have a native ability to, Azure Data Explorer has a native ability to pull in data from these sources, like for example, Event Hub. You have native integrations, like Azure Functions, for example, is an example, which is able to send data to Azure Data Explorer. And obviously there are API capabilities, so you can use your own solution to build your own log collector, for example, for your own custom applications or whatever. But I actually became very fond of Logstash, which is a tool by Elastic. It is free, it's open source, and Logstash has a very active community with a lot of different input and output connectors, and Azure Data Explorer is also one of them. And I actually helped quite a lot of customers onboarding all kinds of log strategies with Logstash together with Azure Data Explorer, but I'll come back to that later. You can run that on a virtual machine, but also on your AKS cluster if you want to make it really high available if you'd like to. Another hidden feature, well, it was hidden to me, so I think it's interesting to share, is that Azure Data Explorer has the ability to create what they call external tables. And there you can refer to Azure Blob Storage. And the great thing of this, and I'll show it in a demo later, is that you can actually then apply KQL query language to data which resides on Blob Storage. It is obviously by far the slowest option of all, but it works. So those Azure diagnostic logs you're all familiar with, like the Key Vault logs or the storage account logs. You have a bunch of JSON files in a lot of blob containers, and it's nearly impossible to actually find something. And I'll show a demo later on how you can use Azure Data Explorer to actually find something in those logs. So log ingestion, again, you can create multiple databases if you like, and within each database you can have a different retention period, but also a different set of permissions. So what I also really like about Azure Data Explorer, you can go to dataexplorer.azure.com, which is a separate portal if you like, and people don't actually even need access to the Azure resource itself, but if they have access to a database in ADX, they can go to the Data Explorer portal and they can already query the logs without even having access to the Azure resource.
So you can basically eliminate permissions that you must set
Yeah,
in the Azure portal and
yeah.
just guide them to the real data.
Yeah, and it's very easy. For example, if you have a network team and you have a separate database with all the separate tables for your proxy logs, your firewall logs, what have you not, VPN concentrators, I don't know, and you can
Network
actually
Watcher.
grant sorry?
Network Watcher and all
Yeah,
the
yeah,
other
Network Watcher.
Azure
So you can
resources.
grant the network team access to that database, and they can use the Data Explorer portal to access the logs without even having to log into the Azure portal itself.
Okay, so if you have, for example, your application teams,
Yeah,
maybe you have 50 or 70 development teams,
yeah,
you're saying like, well, I can also create only for their logs a specific database which they
yeah,
can reach out
yeah.
without using high advanced Grafana dashboards or that kind of stuff.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. And normally you would, if the data resides in Sentinel, you have to grant them to the access to permissions to the Sentinel workspace or the resource group, of course. And then you have to figure out, I don't know, your whole RBAC setup, which you have in Azure with certain groups and management groups, etc.
Which is a
And
pain. I mean,
yeah, which can be a pain, specifically because in Sentinel there is no way to grant access to only a specific set of tables. It's an all or nothing solution.
yeah,
And with Azure Data Explorer, if you grant somebody here on the database itself, they don't need access to the resource group or the ADX cluster. They don't need any Azure permissions on any of the Azure related resources. They still need an Entra ID account, of course, and that account should be linked to a group or straight into the database itself. But they can go to dataexplorer.azure.com and they can find this database and query it.
that is a really a nice use case.
Yeah.
I'll write them down for myself as well.
Okay, great.
And I also have, I think, another feature which can be interesting if you are in a high confidential environment. ADX is one of the first technologies which is also encryptable with your own CMK, your customer managed key.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
If it's coming from an HSM or you're encrypting it by yourself with other technologies.
Yeah.
Um,
That's a good point.
It's walking further than the storage account as we know it for now.
Yeah, that's true. I do believe with Sentinel, you can run Sentinel in a dedicated log analytics cluster. And I do believe that customer managed keys are then also a viable option.
On log analytics, it is.
Yeah.
On Sentinel itself, not yet.
Okay. I wasn't aware of that. Okay. That's great to know. Okay. Okay, so within each of these databases, you see in the screenshot here, you have your tables, and this is a familiar view from somebody who uses Sentinel or Defender, so you can KQL the tables within each database. What I also really like with ADX is that you can configure all the tables and all the parsers and the schemas all by code. Microsoft calls this their ADX commands, which are not really KQL, but you can enter them in the search field in ADX. They look more like SQL functions, to be honest. Yeah. So what you can see here is how you can create a table, right, with an entire schema with all the data types at the back. You can create you can determine how your log ingestion will be handled. For example, this is a very long list, but what's interesting here is that you can do some transformation where you can say, okay, data is send in with an at version column, which is an illegal character, the at sign in the table schema. But you can make sure that you have as you can see here on the top line, there's an ls underscore version of that column, and you can transform the logs upon ingest to that, to redirect them to the right column.
That's come in handy.
Yeah. Yeah, and what I also like to do, because I was creating a lot of tables for customers in the past, where, for example, network appliances send certain logs to Logstash, for example. So I had samples of those logs, and I wanted to create the tables at scale from code. So I actually created a simple PowerShell for that, and I was actually hoping that for some reason PowerPoint is not going to. Yeah, there we are. I actually prepared a little demo.
Nice.
Will it? Oh, okay. I know what's going on. When I do not have PowerPoint as an active window, it will not go move forward. So here you can see, I called it get ADX command. I have some sample logs here generated by, in this case, a Blue Coat proxy. These are just syslog messages coming in. And by running the get ADX command against a folder with some log samples, my PowerShell script is actually analyzing those log samples, is determining how many columns are in there and needed. It will also eliminate all the illegal characters and also create in purple here the ADX command for you. So you can just simply copy paste the purple output, paste it in ADX, run it, and then your table, including the correct ingestion mapping with the transformation, is created for you.
Nice. Yeah, I saw another row coming up, right? Which you're opening now.
Sorry?
I saw a one adding into the list.
Yeah. So you saw the table coming up here. So this is called Blue Code CL Raw. I will mention the difference between the raw and non-raw later when we're talking about parsing. But yes, so this is the table that was added with the schema according to the log file. So this can be in handy, and Dinant, I will obviously show a link to a GitHub repository where you can find these scripts.
Cool. Yeah, I think a lot of people that are just joining in are very happy with this.
Yeah, it can be very handy when you start with Azure Data Explorer. Another thing I really like is the parsing functionality. Normally in Sentinel, you would most probably parse on query. And when I say parse on query, I mean that you have a very extensive KQL function written. You have probably stored it as a function inside your Sentinel workspace. And it can look something like this. This is actually an example of that Blue Code log. This is a free community parser on the Microsoft Sentinel GitHub page. You can find it there. And you can copy paste this into Sentinel and it will parse your syslog messages. And as you can see here, it's quite elaborate with all kind of regexes in there to align it with all splitting up the syslog messages in separate columns, right? But the downside of parsing on query is every time you need to look for a certain IP address, for example, you're triggering this entire parser. So if you have thousands or tens of hundreds of thousands of logs coming in each day, and this is the case in larger organizations, you don't want to process all the entire bulk of the logs, parse them, and then filter on a certain source IP address, for example. It is very slow that way. That's why parsing on ingest is preferable over parse on query. But the thing is, parse on ingest is really hard with Sentinel. So with Sentinel, you are relying on data collection endpoint, data collection rule before the log actually land in your table. And you could, in theory, go into the data collection rule and create what they call a transform KQL. And that is a KQL query you attach to the data collection rule, and which could in theory parse your logs before it lands in the table, which is great in theory, but in practice, a lot of KQL functions are not supported there. So what I see regularly happen, and you can see it in the blue code example here as well, syslog messages are split up into several different formats because not every log format is exactly the same. So you split them up, you parse them, and then you group them together with a union, for example. This is very common in parsing, and union is already something that is not supported in the transform KQL. So that is also why you would probably end up parsing on query anyway.
Wow,
With
that's
Azure Data,
cool.
yeah, sorry, Dinant?
Yeah, I'm very curious what's coming next.
Okay, okay, great. So again, this is severely limited. With Azure Data Explorer, you have an alternative. As you noticed from this screenshot earlier, and you already mentioned it with the blue code logs, as you see here in the bottom, you see proxy CL and proxy CL raw. There's a reason for that, because the raw table can be used to ingest the actual raw logs in, unparsed, and then you can have Azure Data Explorer parse the logs for you and store the end result in the definitive table, so to speak. And how that works is logs will come in, for example, in this format, as you can see here. This is an example of logs that came in from Event Hub. But you want to make sure that they end up in the table like this, right? In a neatly separated column.
Yeah.
So you have to create a raw table. You have to create a actual destination table. In this case, I was using device network events, which is familiar for Defender for Endpoint users. So these were Defender for Endpoint logs coming in through Event Hub.
Okay.
You have to create a separate, what I would call an expand function. So this is a function you create, and inside the function, there is the actual parsing logic. So as you can see here, the function is actually querying the raw table and doing all the parsing magic. And the output of this function is actually your result you want to keep. And in ADX, you create a fifth resource, so to speak, or a property, which is called an update policy. And what the update policy will do, once new logs enter in those raw table, the update policy is triggered, and it will trigger your expand function and will make sure that the output of the expand function end up in the destination table. And with a cleanup policy, you can also make sure that the raw table logs are automatically removed once they are touched by the update policy. So that case, you won't be storing all the data twice, and you will only end up with the desired end result.
Wow.
You obviously also need to create ingestion mapping for the initial table. So that's why you actually need to perform 5 steps here. And I've shown you 2 steps earlier when creating a regular table. You have to add 3 more lines to completely build a solution like this. So here you can see the expand function and the update policy, and obviously both the raw table and the destination table. And what I really like about these ADX commands is that you can also incorporate it in your CI/CD pipelines. So I was actually doing this for a couple of customers where they were using Azure DevOps with a pipeline like this. And as you can see here, there are reference to multiple custo files on the repository. And these custo files are automatically redeployed against their databases. So whenever they want to incorporate a new parser or a schema change needs to be implemented, they can just simply make a change in the code repository, and Azure DevOps will automatically take care of that and push them to ADX.
Wow, that looks amazing. I hear so many experiences already listening to your story. Wow.
Okay, that's great to hear. That's great to hear. That's nice. So yeah, I know Azure DevOps is maybe not the most popular tool any longer. People are moving a lot to GitHub lately. I did some Googling before preparing for tonight, and I did notice there are a couple of community solutions already there for GitHub as well.
Nice.
So this was the overview I shown earlier. If we put ADX also alongside this, I would say that ADX is comparable to basic, perhaps a little bit auxiliary. I would consider it medium touch data as well. It has minimal cost. Your queries are now included because you already paid for the ADX cluster, right? So you're not paying extra for additional queries. You have full KQL capabilities, no longer limitations like you had with basic and auxiliary. You have virtually unlimited retention. I would say that 100 years is, well, potentially unlimited.
Yeah,
You
definitely.
can still do not have the ability to do real-time alerts in Sentinel, which is still a pity. But well, then again, it is for a different reason. I would say that you store logs there. You also do not have a native support yet. I'm not sure if Microsoft is willing to add it. If you know, when you enable Azure Diagnostics on AKS cluster or Key Vault or storage account, you
That's
can
true.
only stream to storage account or log analytics, not ADX or an event hub. You can do that, but not ADX natively.
No, I only know that you can export it, but it's in Azure Sentinel, right? To an ADX.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, but then you have to first store it in Sentinel, and you're
Exactly.
already
Yeah.
then you're already charged for that amount you send to Sentinel. So then you can probably just keep it there instead of also sending it to ADX.
I agree. Yeah.
Yeah, but it would be great. You can stream Azure Diagnostic logs through Event Hub to ADX, but you have to consider Event Hub as an additional cost in that scenario, of course.
Yeah.
High performance again is possible, but it will really cost you. So I would stay away from SSD caching on ADX because again, you'll probably defeating the purpose and recreating your own log analytics workspace. And there's obviously the discussion about additional overhead. So the ADX cluster, although it's a platform service, you don't have to manage all the individual virtual machines and the software in the backend. Microsoft is taking care of that, but you do need to pay attention at some metrics, I would say. So your cloud operations team should probably incorporate some alerts to make sure that memory and CPU and those kinds of things are not don't go over certain thresholds.
Yeah. Yeah. That would be wisely.
It is something to consider as additional cost, so to speak. What was funny, when I looked at the pricing for ADX, I did a calculation on Azure Calculator, and I just took, as an example, 100 gigs a day ingest. And the actual pricing of a complete ADX cluster came down to 12 cents per gigabyte, which is exactly the same price as auxiliary logs. And I think that's not a coincidence. I think Microsoft is actively targeting ADX users with this, with auxiliary logs. But if you ingest even more logs in ADX, and if you go up to a terabyte a day, for example, then obviously the cost per gigabyte goes down even further, as low as 3 cents per gigabyte in this case.
Nice add-on to make the pricing.
Yeah, and then obviously you have some discounts on both Sentinel but also ADX. So ADX you can use reserved instances again for the backend VMs, for example. But well, you have to do some investigation in that. I thought it was interesting, Dinan, to share a real-world example of a customer who was actually wanting to store their Defender XDR logs for long term, longer than the 30 days, to see what actually was the cost savings they got when moving to Azure Data Explorer.
Nice. Yeah.
So when you have a Defender XDR and you want to store the logs into Sentinel, we discussed this earlier, it will be very pricey. This particular customer had over 160,000 devices and they wanted to store all 19 tables for long term, which ended up with 25 billion messages a day, which is 69 terabytes of data every month, which is huge, of course.
Yeah.
If you want to store 69 terabytes a month in Sentinel, well, you can do the math. Even with the lowest price available with the highest commitment tier, you'll end up with 170,000 euros a month in cost on the Sentinel side, which is obviously very expensive. I did the exact same setup with Event Hub namespace in between, where I leveraged the streaming API from Defender XDR, stream all the logs into Event Hub namespace. I actually needed multiple Event Hub namespaces to take care of all the load from all the logs. But even considering the prices for Event Hub namespace and ADX, the end cost was only 7,500 euros a month for well, similar setup.
Wow.
And this is obviously a little bit comparing apples and oranges, because I am aware that Sentinel is high performant, really brings you much more performance, and it is a fully integrated solution. Azure Data Explorer, again, all the setup of creating this takes some time. You have to investigate some effort in that as well, and the end result is a slower response on your query. But for most companies who don't want those logs to be available for, again, for forensics reasons or whatever, I think this is a very viable solution.
Yeah, it's really depending on your use case, and
Yeah,
in this case, how quickly do you need the data?
yeah, yeah,
And
that's true.
if it's not that critical, it's really a competitor indeed.
Yeah, that's true. So one thing I was often talking with customers about, and it's probably familiar to you as well, is what I would call a multi-tiered logging strategy. So you can, let's say you have Microsoft Sentinel, you want to have some data in ADX, and let's also say for argument's sake that you have a storage account with some blob logs on there. How are you going to distribute the logs, and how are you going to actually query the logs? And this is also even as much as important as how much you pay for it, I guess. I would say Sentinel is still the place to go for real-time analytics, to have near real-time alert rules, to trigger on certain incidents when they came in on your sign-in logs, for example. Don't mess with that. I would say keep them in Sentinel. That's what it's built for. Use your ADX for your triage, for your incident response, for example, and for your hunting, and perhaps even some forensics analysis. And you can use your blob storage also for forensics and also regulatory compliance needs, for example, because that will still be the lowest cost tier you have available. So agents like you have on your virtual machine can send data to Sentinel. Your event hub namespaces can store data into ADX. You can have your Azure diagnostic logs stored into Sentinel or into blob storage. But what about those network logs we touched on earlier? And this is again where I think Logstash really shines and comes in, because Logstash can send data to everywhere. So you have output connectors for Logstash to store data to multiple destinations based on certain criteria. And then you can, for example, say, okay, the Palo Alto threat alert, I want those to store it into Sentinel for real-time analytics, so that I can trigger a security incident on. But all the raw traffic logs, I don't care for that much. Store those in ADX or even in blob storage, for example.
This is really awesome. Yeah.
And what's also great, because Logstash has a big community with all kinds of input plugins, you can even use an input plugin to get data out of databases. And this is something I actually built for a customer. They had a custom application in-house where all kinds of sign-ins went outside of the Entra ID because those were just end users, consumers for them using an application, and they logged on with their own personal email addresses and passwords. And those were stored in the several databases, and Logstash is able to grab those tables out of those databases and store them into Sentinel. And in Sentinel, you can trigger incidents on them again on certain criteria, for example. And even files, you can even ingest those into Logstash as well. So that is why I think Logstash is a really, I called it a Swiss Army knife for log collecting in my blogs a couple of times now. And I think this is really where it shines.
Wow, cool. Thanks.
And in the GitHub repo, I'll share with you. I also share this example shown on screen here. So this is, for example, a syslog listener on Logstash. You can have a filter in between where you can say, okay, I want to do some mutation when a host is, for example, a certain IP address, because I know that's a VPN concentrator or a firewall or whatever, or this is the proxy logs. I need to add a tag Sentinel, and if the IP address is different, I want a tag added ADX, for example. And then once you go into the output, you can say, okay, if the tag is Sentinel, send it to my data collection rule and my data collection endpoint. And if the tag was ADX, then you have to send it to this database in ADX, for example. So this way you can split up a log collection across multiple different tiers, so to speak.
Nice.
And querying the data is then perhaps an additional challenge. So your security analyst obviously can have access to Sentinel and perhaps even the ADX UI, but they can also query logs on blob storage using the external table feature. I'll show in a second. But you can also provide, like I mentioned earlier, you can also grant permissions to ADX for your threat hunters or even, I don't know, auditors who can also use ADX to query logs on the blob storage again that way. And this comes down to my last demo for today. We actually prepared a recording for that as well to show you how this could work in practice, because there's even a trick you can use inside the Defender portal to query Defender logs as well. Let's hope that this video will play. Yes, so this is pre-recorded, obviously, then I'm sure that everything will go the right way. So here's a terminal window I'm opening up, and I'm actually connecting to a Logstash instance on Azure. Let me see if I can hide the bar there. I think it will go away now. So this is a Ubuntu virtual machine with a certain IP address, 10.0.0.4. And this is important for something I'm going to show in a second. And here I'll be opening up the Logstash config, and this is a similar config I've shown in the slide earlier. So I called this my syslog to data lake config. And in here you can see a similar approach with Sentinel and ADX, both in the output fields, and based on the source IP address, I'm redirecting logs. So let's fire up Logstash. And normally you would be running this as a daemon, of course, as a service and not interactively, but this is how I can show how it works. So here you can see it is opening up a syslog listener on port 5514 on localhost. And I'm opening up a new tab and I'm connecting to that same machine again because I'm going to emulate some syslog messages. So I'm actually using the logger command in Linux to simulate a syslog message. And in this case, I'm sending to my own IP address, 10.0.0.4, in a Ceph formatted syslog. And this is just an example of a blue code proxy message. I send it twice, and if I go back to Sentinel Logstash, you can see it is actually successfully posted the log into Log Analytics DCR stream. So this is going to Sentinel because that was part of the plan. Now I'm logging into a separate virtual machine, also a Ubuntu machine, but this is running on 10.0.0.6 as an IP address. So when I send that same logger command here, with the same message, send it also to the same Logstash machine with .4, but this is now coming from a different machine. It should trigger a different output plugin because now the source is different. And as you can see in Logstash, you'll see that it's opening up a Custo channel. Again, Custo is ADX. So it's sending these logs to my ADX cluster. And then here in Sentinel, you can see when I query those proxy logs, they're there. And you can actually see that these actually came from 10.0.0.4. So this is Logstash 01. That was the name of the virtual machine for this demo. And when I go into ADX and do the same query, you'll see that you can find the logs here coming from the Logstash 02, 10.0.0.6. And this case, I used a raw table, so I could actually prepare a non-raw variant with also a parser. So this data was already parsed on ingest. So as you can see here, all the table separation, the column separation, with all the log web categories and HTTP status and everything is in there nicely separated and already parsed in a separate table for me. Another cool trick is when you go into the Defender portal. So this is really helpful for your security analysts. So when you go into the Defender portal, you might also want to query those proxy logs in ADX, for example. And something that you can do in advanced hunting, you can actually refer to functions residing in Sentinel workspaces. So in this case, you'll see an example. I use device events. Well, this is just my regular device events in Defender for Endpoint. Everybody's familiar with those probably. But I have a separate version, ADX underscore device events. And when I run that query, the results will come back a little bit slower because, of course, it's on ADX. But you will get your device events from the ADX cluster straight here from the Defender portal. And the way how this works is because I created in Sentinel a function which is called ADX device events. And inside that function, I load up the ADX function, which is a KQL function. And there I provided the name of my ADX cluster and the database. And this is a neat trick to work around the fact that you otherwise need to switch portals, for example. You can use it without the Sentinel function as well to, for example, query the network logs, and I can query my proxy logs I just sent with Logstash and look for a certain IP address, for example. And again, the results are a bit slower because ADX and we didn't have any SSD caching, but this is, I think, a perfect way for a security analyst to look for a certain IP address while they're investigating a different security incident, for example. The last thing I wanted to show is those diagnostic logs. So let's go into a key vault. I prepared up front and I enabled the diagnostic logs. Well, you're familiar with this, I guess. So in here, I'm sending it to a blob storage. And when I look into this blob storage, and this is something we discussed earlier, you'll find a lot of blob containers there with the entire resource ID of the key vault. So you have to drill down through all the containers until you eventually end up in the key vault, and then logs are separated in year, month, day, and even hours and minutes, I believe. And then you end up with a JSON file. And yeah, of course, you can download this JSON file and you can open it up and you can look inside the logs, but it's of course impossible to actually find anything in there, especially when you have to cover a longer time span if you want to look through logs for a month or a week for something, for example. I created a PowerShell script for this as well. Get ADX external table commands, and when you run this PowerShell script against your blob storage, it will actually connect to that blob storage. It uses a temporary location, in this case my desktop. It's connected to the blob storage. It will find diagnostic logs on there. It will download a simple single file to the temporary location, and then it will do something similar as I showed earlier. It will analyze the log file. It will see it has 12 columns in there, and it will construct for you automatically the ADX command. You can just copy and paste in Azure Data Explorer, and this is a very easy way to create that external table in ADX without having knowledge about the entire schema up front. And if you look into the database now in ADX, you'll find an external table called audit event. Unfortunately, you cannot use this in the Defender portal. Perhaps that will come in the future. So you do have to use the UI from ADX. But as you can see here, here are all the key vault operations inside the blob storage, like secret get and key list and etc. So you can actually find something in there in a certain time span.
Nice. That's a great demo. Yeah, definitely worthwhile to investigate.
Nice. Well, I'm glad that you're learning also here, Dinant.
Yeah. Never stop learning, right?
Great. Yeah, so actually this was the last demo. So I actually only had a couple of key takeaways. Again, be careful with high volume logs due to cost. And I think more affordable tiers in Sentinel are very interesting to look at, but they come with severe limitations. And I think ADX can provide a low-cost alternative. But of course, it will require additional setup and monitoring. And this is something you have to consider as well. And we touched on this earlier. What about Copilot for security? We don't know what future lies ahead for that. Will it support ADX in the future, or are you limiting functionality for that once data is moved away from Sentinel into ADX, for example? And for that reason, auxiliary logs might be a great option. Search through your blobs with ADX. I think that's a neat trick, and I guess Logstash proved again to be a Swiss Army knife, like I mentioned in my blogs before.
Is that your knife?
No. This was just a Google Images, and I actually photoshopped a Logstash on top of this.
Yeah, no, just joking.
No. This was a regular red Swiss Army knife, of course.
Okay, okay. Well, it's amazing story what you have shown us in that short of time. A lot of stuff to think about, like how are I'm getting to do with my logs. Do I want to store them? It's almost an architectural
Yeah,
things first,
yeah.
and then to see like which functionality I can offload basically to Sentinel or to ADX. So a lot of stuff to think about, my
Yeah, I'll
friend.
make sure that I'll share the GitHub repo with the PowerShell scripts and also some examples so that you can put it in the show notes or whatever. I
Yeah,
can
yeah,
imagine
I
you want
will
to
put
share
them
those.
below the
Yeah.
video for people that want to deep dive into that. So
Yeah, and for people wanting to store their Defender for Endpoint logs in the ADX, I also build a separate PowerShell tool which will actually automate the whole deployment of Event Hub and ADX for you from code automatically. And then you only have to set up the streaming API and then you're done. You have an archive for your Defender logs, so to speak.
I'm just hearing another episode coming up.
Yeah, well, we can talk about that in a different episode if you like. Yeah, sure.
Well, Koos, it's amazing that you have shown us this information. Looking forward to read your blogs, but I will post them below this video. Um,
Thanks.
Thanks again for all your time and your effort.
Yeah,
Also,
thanks
your
for having me.
presentation, it was smoothly set up, so thank you for that.
Thanks. Yeah, I like to put some effort in that. I have a knack for animations and some little bit of graphics design, so that's a little bit of a pet peeve of mine. Yeah,
It
thanks.
looks amazing, so thank you for that. Let's round up for today. Thank you very much again.
No
Hopefully,
problem.
you come back for another session
Yeah, sure,
for
anytime.
another security topic.
Yeah, sure.
And for now, thanks everybody for listening. Good luck with all the exploring in the blog and all the information. And
Yeah,
if there is something, please leave a message below to come in contact if you have more questions. And otherwise, till next time. Take
till next
care.
time. Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye bye.